Another person on Facebook called Paulo Mulier asked me why we lost the battle after the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall, if it's supposed to be a one for us.
Yeah, I think the answer would be that people drew the wrong lesson. I think they drew the lesson that central planning may not work, but the Western style of still a lot of government and some free market, but sometimes very heavily regulated and with a heavy welfare state. This is the better way to go. So they did not think of it as liberty versus tyranny. They thought of it as tyranny versus um, a middle of the road system. And I think they believe the middle of the road system succeeded.
Let's move a little bit to American politics. What do you think of Gary Johnson? I made you this question before, but I want you to ask you here.
Well, I mean, there are worse politicians than Gary Johnson, but I find him to be, and I have been a supporter of Gary Johnson. I've not voted for him in the past, but I've said good things about him, and those can be found online. But I guess this year I became impatient with him because I thought he does have a great opportunity to get attention this year, and yet he's still as boring as ever. I mean, he's had 4 years to improve his style, to learn more about libertarianism, not to get trapped so easily by trick questions, to be ready for the tough questions. I don't get that sense with him at all. I think he's very much an intellectual lightweight, he's unimpressive, and for him to go around saying that libertarianism takes the best from these people and the best from those people, and we'll bring them together. No, these people are terrible, awful, horrible people, and so are these. We have nothing to do with them at all. And especially in a year when people are so angry with Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, they are angry, and he's saying, that Hillary Clinton has been a wonderful public servant. Those were his words, a wonderful public servant, and we're going to take the best of both. I would say to the contrary, look, if you're angry, how are you going to get what you want by voting for the same people? You know,
Yeah.
and you know what? I'm not half like this group and half like that group. I'm 100% the opposite of all of them. Okay, and you may say, oh, that's a little bit too radical for me. But you know what? Has anything else worked? Why don't you give this a try? Give me 4 years, and if you hate me, I'll never talk to you again. I would just be bold and upfront with people. So I don't like this whole wimpy, we're going to govern a little bit better, and government solutions don't always work as well. People are past that.
We have the Republican and the Democrats, and we have Trump and Hillary Clinton.
Hmm.
Is there any difference, really?
I actually do think there is some difference, especially this year. I mean, I think the key difference that you'd see would, even though it's obviously hard to predict what Donald Trump will do because we can't get him to tell us, or when he does tell us, 3 days later he tells us the opposite, so I can't even figure it out. I mean, I cannot figure out his foreign policy. On the one hand, he says, Libya was a mistake and we shouldn't do nation building. And on the other hand, he recommends crazy neoconservative books on foreign policy. So I can't figure him out. But I would say that the Supreme Court choices would be very different. I think Hillary Clinton would probably pick pretty hard left people on the Supreme Court. And whereas Trump has actually submitted some names, he said, these are the names I would draw from. And he went to the Federalist Society, which is a conservative libertarian legal association, and he asked them for some names, and he put them out. And I do think the Supreme Court is important. But what would be in common with them is that really they both seem to have this view that society really needs a strong man running it. Issuing orders, issuing commands, directing production, directing trade, ordering people around.
In one word, a dictator.
Yeah, I mean, if not quite a dictator, then certainly somebody who feels who doesn't share our view that society has certain built-in ways of ordering it itself. They believe that society is all chaos until the great legislator or the great executor is in charge. And that, of course, is a big problem. And they would have differences on health care, but Trump would still favor a substantial government involvement. They both want the minimum wage increased, except Trump thinks the states should do it and Hillary thinks the federal government should do it. This is what we're fighting over. I mean, they have some differences on trade. I think that's no denying that. That Hillary has favored these trade deals that Trump is opposed to, and I think they have a major difference on immigration. I don't think there's any denying that. Normally, there's no difference on immigration between the Republicans and the Democrats. So for Trump to be nominated, there is actually a difference on that. But other than that, beneath the surface, I think with Trump it would be a lot of improvisation. Well, I kind of feel we should do this, so let's do this. He doesn't want to put himself in an ideological straitjacket, where he says, I have to favor liberty all the time. He says, I'm a common sense conservative. And common sense means, frankly, I'm going to make it up as I go along.
Whatever looks better, I take it.
Yeah. I think that's what it is.
I have seen you and the Congressman Ron Paul on Congress talking about and questioning the Fed about how it destroyed Americans' money and how it monopolized all the currencies that Americans use. That's something I have never seen in my country.
Mm.
Is it been worthy? Have you seen any change in the rest of the congressmen and American people?
Well, I mean, there are congressmen now who want to ask questions of the Fed, serious questions, and that is very much a change. We have books coming out, not just from the Mises Institute, about ending the Fed. On my own show, I interviewed recently John Tamny. He runs RealClearMarkets.com. Well, that's a pretty sizable site, and he's an Austrian fellow traveler, I would say, or maybe if not an Austrian, but he's not in the Mises Institute circles. He just wrote a book on, it's called something like Who Needs the Fed? So that did not happen before. And also in the TV news and in financial commentaries, you see people who are absolutely opposed to the Fed who want to abolish it being asked for their opinion. That did not exist before. That was not an opinion that was featured in the TV news or in the newspapers. So this is going to take a long time, but what Ron Paul did was take an issue that had been sitting there for nearly 100 years, and which had never been the source of partisan argument, and suddenly cracked it open to the point where people grudgingly acknowledge that there is another group of people out there who aren't just arguing about what the Fed's policy should be. They're arguing about whether there should be a Fed policy. That's a huge contribution for basically one person to make.
Do you think is it worth it to have libertarians in Congress?
I have friends who disagree with me on this. I think it's a good thing. I think it's very hard to get a good one who stays good, but I think the reason you want them there is that if they're not there, people will look at the people who are there and say, well, this must be the range of options I have. I have the right-wing interventionists and the left-wing interventionists. I guess I better choose. If there's a libertarian, even one, who is saying no to this, it lets them understand that there are more options. And most people do not learn political philosophy by reading books. They learn it by reading in the newspaper about the elections. And if we're not a voice in those elections, how are they ever going to hear about us?
All of this about the Fed and how how they destroyed American money comes mainly, I understand, from the Austrian School of Economics. Can you explain what is the difference between the Austrian school from the mainstream, the Chicago and the Keynesian?
Well, they would not deny that if the Fed were to create an awful lot of money under certain circumstances, that it would raise consumer prices and this would be undesirable. They don't dispute that. But the Austrian criticism goes well beyond the point about consumer prices, because there can be times when the Fed is doing things we disapprove of. It's expanding credit and the money supply, and consumer prices do not rise. In the 1920s, the Fed did these things, and consumer prices did not rise. And the forerunners of the, let's say, like early Chicago people, like forerunners of the mature Chicago school, like Irving Fisher, said that the economy's fine. The Fed's doing a great job. The price level is stable. But what that concealed the micro effects of what the Fed was doing. First of all, prices should have been falling in the 1920s. They stayed stable. But the problem is that the Fed's manipulation of money and credit sends ripples through the economy, and it changes the kinds of decisions entrepreneurs make when they look at how easy or difficult it is to borrow money. This affects the kinds of projects they undertake, because the longer your project, the more the interest rate is important to it. Because obviously, if you have a 30-year mortgage on your house, and the interest rate goes down by even a fraction of a percentage point, that has a big effect on your monthly payment. If you had a 1-month mortgage, you wouldn't even notice the difference. So the longer your project, the more sensitive it is to interest rates. So when interest rates are pushed down by the Fed, it makes entrepreneurs engage in longer term projects. But it turns out that these projects are not really what society wants or needs at that time. The general public is not prepared to save the resources necessary to complete them all. So it gets the economy on what seems to be a prosperous track. But eventually, now obviously you need a little bit more time to flesh this out, but eventually the economy catches up with all this, says, wait, this is all fake. This is not how these resources should be arranged. And then you get the recession, which is where the economy says, look, these resources really belong over here. And this project should be abandoned completely. And so this is what we talk about, the Austrians. And you don't see that with the Keynesians. And so this is why we were saying there's going to be something going on related to housing and other stuff in the 2000s because of all the pushing interest rates artificially low.
Could you give us some words of encouraging for all of the libertarians in Chile who try to increase the movement, and all those entrepreneurs who are trying to fight against all these laws and regulations that just stop everything?
All right, well, you guys are all the great heroes of civilization, and you won't be told that by people who should tell you that, but I'm telling you, you're the great heroes. And I would say, first of all, we have these great tools, YouTube, social media. We have to think of ways to be clever, funny, grab people's attention. But I would say that in Chile, it sounds to me like the libertarian movement is where the American libertarian movement was in the late 1960s. And it seemed hopeless, and there were so few. But look where we are now. We have millions. 2 million people voted for Ron Paul in 2012. Even though most of the people who wanted to vote for him were not registered Republicans, so they couldn't vote for him. So millions more support him. And he was a guy who was saying the opposite of everything they'd ever been taught in school. So it's very hard. It's easy for Bernie Sanders to get votes. Bernie Sanders is the socialist guy running in the U.S. It's easy for him to get a lot of votes because he's just saying what they all learned in school. Ron was saying the opposite of what they learned in school. And he was saying it in the most in-your-face way imaginable. And millions of people supported him. We now have millions of libertarians. So, what will be the Chilean libertarian moment? I don't know, but I hope to be able to see it.
Dr. Tom, I don't want to take more of your time. Thanks a lot for your time, and I hope I can interview again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.